I want you to attend the gala on my behalf. But ma'am, I'm only a cleaner. Attend or lose your job.
The cleaner went to a party on behalf of the rich lady. CEO saw her and fell in love with her at first sight. Esteemed viewers, welcome to Luxurious True Life Stories. Please like and subscribe for more captivating luxury true stories. Let's get into the story. The apartment trembled every time the train passed, rattling the thin windows and shaking dust from the ceiling. Deborah Brown barely reacted anymore. She stood by the tiny stove stirring a pot of watered soup while counting coins on the table beside her. The rent notice lay under her elbow, the red stamp screaming louder than the train outside. Behind the curtain separating the room, her mother coughed again, weak but trying to hide it. Deborah tasted the soup and added the last pinch of salt she owned, forcing a smile before carrying the bowl to the bed. Her mother pretended to be asleep whenever Deborah entered because she didn't want her daughter to see how much pain she was in. Deborah pretended not to notice because she didn't want her mother to feel guilty. Their conversations had become soft lies meant to protect each other. Deborah spoke about a better job she would soon get, about a future house near a park, about quiet mornings without noise. Her mother listened with tired eyes full of pride, not belief. The medicine bottle on the table was nearly empty and both of them knew it. Late that night Deborah sat alone near the window sketching dresses in an old notebook she never showed anyone. Fashion had been her dream once, before hospitals replaced everything. The train roared past again, but this time she whispered to herself that one day she would live somewhere silent. She closed the book carefully, hid it under her pillow, and looked at her sleeping mother. Fear stayed in her chest, but determination slowly replaced it. Morning came with cold hospital lights instead of sunlight. Deborah stood at the billing counter while the clerk repeated the amount without emotion, sliding the paper back each time Deborah asked for more time. The numbers felt unreal, larger than anything she could earn in months. Around her, families spoke in low, worried voices, but she stayed quiet, gripping her bag as if it could somehow produce money. She emptied the contents onto the counter, coins, folded notes, and finally the small necklace her mother had given her years ago. The clerk hesitated but accepted it for partial payment and stamped the receipt. Deborah thanked her softly even though the relief was temporary. Down the hall she paused before entering the ward, forcing her expression calm so her mother would not see fear. Inside the room she spoke gently about how everything was handled and treatment would continue. Her mother smiled, knowing the tone was braver than the truth. Deborah adjusted the blanket, sat beside her, and held her hand longer than usual. For the first time she realized she was bargaining with time, not bills. Dawn arrived quietly, without the usual cough that woke Deborah every morning. She stirred from the chair beside the bed and noticed the stillness first, then the unnatural calm in her mother's face. For a moment she waited, hoping for movement, a breath, anything familiar. None came. The machines beside the bed gave a flat tone that drew a nurse into the room, but Deborah already understood before anyone spoke. She held her mother's hand, warm fading into cold, and whispered words she had never managed to say while she was alive. Paperwork followed faster than grief. Forms, signatures, instructions, and polite voices guiding her through steps she barely heard. By afternoon she stood outside the hospital carrying a small box containing the few belongings returned to her. The world outside moved normally, people hurrying past, traffic lights changing, conversations continuing. Deborah felt separated from it all, as if life had moved forward without asking whether she was ready. At the cemetery she remained long after others left, the sky turning grey above her. She spoke softly about the future she had promised, about learning to stand alone, about refusing to disappear no matter how small she felt. When the wind picked up she finally stepped away, not stronger yet, but unwilling to collapse. For the first time she had nowhere to rush back to, and that emptiness became the reason she decided she had to survive. Days passed inside a quiet apartment that felt larger now only because one voice was missing. Deborah organized what little remained, folding clothes carefully and stacking unpaid envelopes into a corner she promised herself she would face later. The landlord's footsteps often paused outside her door longer than before, a silent reminder that sympathy would soon turn into demand. She needed steady work, not temporary errands, and the urgency pushed her out into the city with a folder of simple documents and fading confidence. At the employment center, a crowded board displayed opportunities she was unqualified for, positions requiring experience she never had time to gain. She moved from listing to listing until one caught her attention: domestic house assistant, Wilson Estate. The pay was unusually high, far beyond similar jobs. Other applicants around her whispered about the mansion's strict reputation, yet the number on the paper held her gaze. She copied the address carefully before doubt could interfere and submitted her application with hands steadier than she felt. Leaving the building, she stood across the street reading the address again, committing it to memory as if it were a doorway rather than a risk. The city noise surrounded her but didn't overwhelm her this time. She no longer waited for life to become gentle. She decided she would enter it directly, no matter how uncomfortable the place might be. Folding the paper into her pocket, she walked home with a direction she hadn't felt since before the hospital corridors took over her days. The Wilson estate stood behind tall iron gates polished to a mirror shine, the driveway curving through trimmed hedges toward a marble mansion larger than any building Deborah had ever entered. She paused at the entrance long enough to steady her breathing before pressing the bell. A butler opened the door, his posture precise and voice measured as he guided her into a waiting hall where several other applicants already sat, all dressed far more formally than she was. One by one they were called inside a private office. Some returned within seconds with tight expressions, others avoided eye contact entirely as they left. When Deborah's turn came, she entered to find Caroline Wilson seated behind a long desk, her gaze sharp and evaluating. Caroline asked simple questions but interrupted answers, corrected posture, and pointed out flaws in tone and appearance. The purpose was clear: obedience mattered more than experience. Deborah answered honestly even when silence might have been safer. Instead of dismissing her immediately, Caroline studied her longer than the others. The room stayed quiet until Caroline finally wrote something on a document and handed it across the desk. Deborah read the word accepted and looked up in surprise she couldn't hide. Caroline's expression remained unreadable as she gave strict instructions for arrival time and behavior, dismissing her without warmth. Walking out of the mansion, Deborah realized she had just stepped into a life she didn't understand yet but could not afford to refuse. Deborah arrived before sunrise carrying the small bag that now held everything important to her. The staff entrance led her into a narrow corridor very different from the polished halls guests would see. A tall man introduced himself as Gregory Hale, the head butler, and handed her a printed list of rules longer than any contract she had ever signed. Every movement inside the mansion followed schedule and hierarchy. Speaking first to the employer was forbidden, questioning orders discouraged, mistakes remembered. His tone was calm but absolute. He walked her through the service areas, laundry rooms humming constantly, a spotless kitchen already active, storage rooms labeled with precision. Other employees glanced at her briefly before returning to work, except Teresa, a senior maid whose polite smile carried clear disapproval. She assigned Deborah repetitive tasks meant to be finished quickly yet perfectly, correcting small details repeatedly. Deborah listened quietly, memorizing everything instead of defending herself, aware that observation mattered more than comfort here. By afternoon she understood the mansion functioned less like a home and more like a system designed to run without emotion. Footsteps echoed differently depending on which hallway she entered, and certain doors remained permanently closed. When Caroline passed through the corridor, everyone paused automatically until she disappeared again. Deborah realized she had stepped into a place where presence depended on usefulness, and she focused on learning fast enough to remain necessary. Evening preparations filled the dining hall with careful motion as staff arranged crystal glasses and polished silverware under Teresa's watchful eye. Deborah followed instructions exactly, aligning each setting with measured distance the way Gregory had demonstrated. When Caroline entered wearing a silk evening dress, silence spread through the room instantly. She inspected the table slowly, saying nothing until she reached Deborah's section, where a wine glass suddenly tipped and spilled across the cloth. Caroline's gaze fixed on Deborah despite no one seeing her touch it. Teresa immediately stepped back, avoiding involvement, and Gregory waited for Deborah's response. Deborah apologized and began cleaning without argument, though confusion lingered in her eyes. Caroline's tone stayed calm but cutting as she ordered the entire table reset and assigned Deborah additional cleaning duties for carelessness. The other staff resumed work quietly, aware the situation was a test rather than an accident. Later, alone in the service corridor, Deborah noticed the base of the glass had been slightly unstable from the start. She understood then the mistake had been arranged to measure reaction, not skill. Instead of anger she adjusted her approach, working more carefully and speaking less. By the time the dining hall was restored, Caroline passed again without comment, but Deborah sensed the evaluation had not ended. It had only begun. The garden behind the mansion stretched farther than Deborah expected, lined with trimmed hedges and stone paths leading to a glass greenhouse. Teresa sent her outside to reorganize storage crates, a task clearly meant to keep her away from indoor duties. While moving heavy pots she noticed the gardener, Oliver Grant, sitting on a low wall pressing cloth against a cut on his palm, soil scattered around him where a tool had slipped. Deborah approached carefully and offered help without drawing attention. Using clean water and a strip torn from an unused cleaning cloth, she wrapped the wound securely the way she had learned during hospital days. Oliver watched in surprise at the quiet efficiency, thanking her with a soft laugh that broke the usual stiffness of the estate. He warned her the staff avoided kindness openly because it often invited problems, but promised he would return the favor if she ever needed assistance. Before returning inside she adjusted the displaced pots so Teresa would not notice the delay. From that afternoon on, Oliver greeted her with brief nods whenever paths crossed, never long enough to be obvious yet sincere enough to matter. The mansion still felt strict and cold, but for the first time Deborah knew at least one person inside it saw her as more than a replaceable worker. While delivering freshly pressed linens to the upper floor, Deborah followed a hallway she had not been assigned before, its carpet thicker and lighting dimmer than the others. Most doors were labeled clearly, yet one stood plain and unmarked at the far end. As she passed, she noticed it slightly open, revealing a room unlike the polished style of the mansion, dusty shelves, covered furniture, and stacked boxes arranged with unusual care. Inside, framed photographs rested against the wall instead of hanging, and documents were sealed in labeled envelopes rather than thrown aside. The air felt preserved, untouched by daily staff routines. Deborah did not step fully inside but studied the space from the doorway, sensing it held something deliberately kept away from the rest of the house. Footsteps approached and she quickly closed the door gently, continuing down the corridor before being noticed. Later that evening she saw Caroline standing near the same hallway, locking the door with a key she wore on a thin chain. Their eyes met briefly before Caroline walked past without comment. Deborah lowered her gaze and continued working, yet curiosity settled quietly in her thoughts. The mansion had many rules, but that door clearly held one unspoken above all others. Late afternoon brought unusual movement through the mansion as Gregory coordinated deliveries of garment boxes and sealed envelopes. A courier arrived personally and requested Caroline's signature, presenting a black embossed invitation thicker than ordinary mail. Deborah happened to be arranging flowers nearby and noticed Caroline read the card only once before placing it down with visible annoyance rather than interest. In the sitting room Caroline discussed the event briefly with Gregory, mentioning a business gala attended by major executives and investors. Her tone suggested obligation, not excitement, and she waved off suggestions about preparation, stating she had no intention of spending an evening among people she found exhausting. Gregory reminded her absence could attract questions she preferred to avoid, but she dismissed the concern and ended the conversation. That evening Deborah collected the discarded envelope while cleaning and recognized the formality of its design without fully understanding its importance. She returned it exactly where she found it, yet the mansion atmosphere shifted afterward, staff preparing garments and accessories despite Caroline's disinterest. Something about the invitation clearly mattered, even if she pretended otherwise, and Deborah sensed it would soon involve more than just a household routine. 2 days before the gala, Caroline stood before her mirror studying her reflection with visible dissatisfaction. Several gowns lay discarded across the bed, none meeting her expectation. Deborah remained quietly in the corner organizing jewelry trays when Caroline suddenly turned and observed her more carefully than usual. The silence stretched long enough to make Deborah uneasy. "Stand up straight," Caroline instructed abruptly. Deborah obeyed, unsure of the purpose. Caroline walked around her slowly, evaluating posture, height, and facial structure as if examining fabric. After a moment she ordered Gregory to cancel her own attendance under a vague excuse and announced that someone else would attend in her place. The staff exchanged brief glances, uncertain who she meant, until Caroline pointed directly at Deborah. Deborah's confusion was immediate. Caroline explained she needed someone to represent her presence discreetly, to appear but not speak excessively, to follow rehearsed responses and avoid revealing personal information. It was not an offer but a command. Gregory hesitated, yet he began arranging necessary documents and attire. Deborah realized she was about to enter a world far beyond the service corridors, not as herself, but as a shadow carrying someone else's name. The evening of the gala arrived with controlled urgency. Stylists entered the mansion through the main entrance rather than the staff wing, carrying garment cases and cosmetic kits. Deborah was seated before a mirror while professionals adjusted her hair, applied subtle makeup, and fitted her into an elegant gown chosen from Caroline's collection. She barely recognized her reflection. The transformation was refined, not excessive, turning her quiet features into something striking without losing their softness. Caroline watched from a distance, correcting small details and reminding her to speak only when addressed. The venue glittered with chandeliers and polished marble floors, guests moving in tailored suits and shimmering dresses beneath soft orchestral music. Deborah entered the hall with Gregory at her side, instructed to remain calm and observant. Conversations surrounded her, filled with business terms she had never heard spoken so casually. She kept her posture steady, answering greetings with brief nods as practiced, careful not to contradict the identity she had been given. Across the room stood Desmond Smith, the billionaire CEO hosting the evening. He had been listening to an investor when his attention shifted unexpectedly toward the entrance. The moment he saw Deborah, something in her composure, calm yet unguarded, drew him away from his conversation. Unlike the others, she did not scan the room with calculation. She seemed quietly present within it. Without hesitation, Desmond excused himself and began walking toward her, unaware that the decision would alter more than just the night. Guests greeted Deborah politely, assuming confidence where she carried caution. She responded carefully, repeating the short prepared phrases Gregory had taught her, avoiding details that might expose her unfamiliarity with their world. Conversations drifted toward investments and partnerships, and she listened more than she spoke, which only made others interpret her silence as composure. The identity she carried felt heavy, yet she maintained it by observing before reacting. Desmond approached with an ease that contrasted the formal atmosphere. Instead of opening with business, he asked if she found the music calming or distracting. The unexpected question caught her off guard, but she answered honestly that it made the room feel less tense. He smiled, noticing the sincerity in her response, and continued speaking with natural curiosity rather than polite obligation. Around them, people assumed recognition between two important figures, leaving them momentarily undisturbed. As the conversation deepened, Deborah focused on remaining consistent with what little she knew about Caroline's public image, but her natural reactions surfaced in small ways. Desmond noticed she listened carefully before answering and never tried to impress him with exaggerated knowledge. The difference intrigued him more than practiced charm ever could. Without realizing it, Both stood apart from the crowd's performance, sharing a quiet exchange that felt strangely genuine in a room designed for appearances. When the orchestra shifted to a slower melody, Desmond extended his hand with a simple invitation to dance. Deborah hesitated only a second before accepting, aware that refusing might draw attention. The dance floor reflected light across polished marble as they moved carefully among other couples. She focused on matching his steps while keeping her thoughts steady, reminding herself she was representing someone else, not living her own moment. Desmond kept the conversation gentle, asking about preferences rather than achievements. Deborah answered cautiously yet sincerely, choosing words that revealed little but felt true. He noticed she never tried to dominate the discussion and instead observed details around her, from the musician's timing to the guests' expressions. The calm awareness in her manner contrasted sharply with the confident personas he encountered daily, and it held his attention more than status ever had. As the music ended, applause echoed softly around them. Deborah stepped back first, remembering her limits, while Desmond studied her with quiet interest. He sensed there was more behind the composed exterior, something unpracticed yet genuine. She excused herself politely and moved toward the balcony for air, unaware that the brief distance only strengthened his determination to understand who she truly was. The balcony overlooked the city lights stretching far beyond the venue, giving Deborah her first quiet moment since arriving. She rested her hands on the railing, breathing slowly to calm the tension of maintaining someone else's identity. The distant traffic sounded softer from above, almost peaceful compared to the crowded hall behind her. For a few seconds she allowed herself to simply exist without rehearsed responses or careful posture. Desmond followed shortly after, not wanting the conversation to end with informal walls. He stopped a respectful distance away, commenting on how different the city appeared from that height. Deborah agreed, admitting it looked calmer from afar than felt within. The honesty slipped out before she could shape it into something safer, but he did not question it. Instead he spoke about how success often made people louder while clarity required silence, a thought that surprised her with its sincerity. Before she could respond further, Gregory appeared near the doorway, signaling it was time to leave before attention grew. Deborah apologized for departing early, offering a brief farewell that carried more warmth than protocol. Desmond watched her go, realizing he had learned almost nothing factual about her yet remembered every detail of how she spoke and listened. As the doors closed behind her, he knew the evening would not end simply as another business gathering. The car ride back remained silent except for the steady movement of tires against the road. Deborah carefully removed the elegant gloves, feeling the weight of the night settle into reality. Gregory handed her a small envelope containing the invitation card she had carried and instructed her to return it exactly as received. His tone was calm but firm, reminding her that nothing about the evening was to be discussed within the staff quarters. Inside the mansion, Caroline waited in the sitting room, still dressed in casual attire, observing Deborah closely as she entered. Without asking how the event went, she questioned only whether anyone asked personal questions and whether Deborah revealed unnecessary details. Deborah answered truthfully that she spoke very little. Caroline seemed satisfied but not relieved, as if measuring risks rather than outcomes. Before dismissing her, Caroline studied her appearance one last time, almost searching for signs the evening had affected her. Finding none, she instructed Deborah to resume normal duties the next morning and behave as though she had never left the estate. Deborah returned to the staff wing, removing the gown carefully and placing it back into its case. The night felt unreal already, yet she sensed its consequences had only begun. The following morning routine returned to its usual precision, but the atmosphere carried subtle tension. Teresa watched Deborah more than before, noticing small details as if searching for something different. Gregory assigned tasks without comment, though his instructions came quicker than usual. Deborah continued her work quietly, determined not to draw attention, yet she felt the mansion observing her in ways it never had. By afternoon a black car arrived at the main gate and remained parked longer than deliveries normally did. From the corridor window, Deborah saw a well-dressed assistant speaking with Gregory at the entrance, handing over a sealed card. Moments later, Gregory walked toward Caroline's office with measured urgency. Staff members exchanged brief glances. Unexpected visitors rarely came without purpose. Soon Caroline summoned Deborah. On her desk lay a formal business card bearing Desmond Smith's name and a short note requesting a meeting regarding the previous evening's conversation. Caroline's expression hardened, her composure sharpening into suspicion as she looked at Deborah. The room stayed silent long enough for the meaning to settle. Someone important was searching not for Caroline, but for the woman who attended in her place. Caroline dismissed Gregory and closed the office door, leaving only herself and Deborah inside. She asked precise questions about every word spoken at the gala, repeating them until she was certain no detail had been omitted. Deborah answered honestly, explaining the conversations remained general and brief. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that Desmond's interests had not followed the identity Caroline intended to present. Caroline's calm posture shifted into controlled irritation. She explained that the meeting request could complicate matters if expectations were misunderstood, and she refused to allow confusion to damage her reputation. Deborah was instructed to remain out of sight if the visitor returned and to deny any involvement if questioned by staff or outsiders. The command carried both warning and blame despite Deborah following every instruction given. Before Deborah left, Caroline added that employment depended on discretion, not curiosity. Deborah nodded quietly and returned to her duties, yet the mansion no longer felt predictable. Somewhere beyond its gates, someone powerful was searching for answers connected directly to her, and silence inside the estate would not prevent the truth from approaching. The next afternoon Desmond arrived personally, his presence shifting the entire mansion's rhythm. Gregory greeted him formally and guided him into the sitting room while staff kept distance but listened carefully. Caroline entered composed and confident, prepared to manage the situation through controlled conversation. Desmond spoke politely about the gala, thanking her for attending and mentioning the discussion they had shared on the balcony. Caroline paused almost imperceptibly before responding, realizing the description did not match any words she could truthfully claim. He continued calmly, describing specific remarks and the sincerity behind them. The silence that followed exposed the misunderstanding more clearly than accusation would. Caroline attempted to redirect the conversation toward business matters, but Desmond's focus did not shift. His interest was not professional courtesy. He was searching for the woman who had stood before him that night. Deborah, instructed to stay away, happened to be carrying fresh linens past the hallway entrance when the conversation reached her ears. She froze, knowing both remaining hidden and stepping forward would change everything. After a long moment she entered the room quietly and acknowledged that she had attended in Caroline's place. The confession settled the tension instantly, replacing confusion with undeniable truth. Desmond looked at her with recognition rather than surprise, while Caroline realized control over the situation had ended. The room remained still after Deborah's admission, the weight of honesty heavier than any accusation. Caroline's composure finally fractured as she questioned why Deborah would step forward without instruction, but Deborah's voice remained steady. She explained she had followed every order and never intended deception beyond what she was told to represent. Desmond listened carefully, recognizing the difference between manipulation and obedience, and the clarity in Deborah's tone confirmed what he had sensed from the beginning. Desmond addressed Caroline with measured professionalism, stating that his interest had always been directed toward the woman he met, not the name she carried. He made it clear that integrity mattered more to him than image, and that the misunderstanding had revealed more about character than reputation ever could. Caroline, unwilling to prolong embarrassment, dismissed Deborah from her position on the spot, framing it as a breach of protocol. Deborah accepted the dismissal calmly, choosing dignity over argument. Outside the estate gates, Deborah stood without employment but without regret. Moments later Desmond joined her, offering not rescue but opportunity, the chance to step into a life defined by her own identity rather than borrowed status. She did not answer immediately, remembering the apartment above the train tracks and the promise she made at the cemetery. This time, however, the future felt earned rather than imagined. With quiet certainty, she chose a new beginning shaped by honesty, freedom, and the unexpected love that had found her when she least expected it. As this story comes to an end, remember that behind every luxury lies a truth few ever see. If this story moved you, support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Until the next unforgettable true story, stay inspired and stay curious.